everybody in here now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. There goes the participant list.
Okay.
Fantastic. Let me know when you want me to take it away. So
We are
many
live.
people. Mm. All right. Should I get started, Anna?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, there I am. Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to Slavery Archive Book Club. It is great to have you all here. We are here today with I'm joining you with my co-host Analcia Araujo, who's professor of history at Howard University. We are also joined by Alex Gil of Columbia University, and we are also joined by Vanessa Holden of University of Kentucky. And we are here, yay, to read and to talk about and ask questions of Dr. Erika Denise Edwards and her phenomenal book, very, very exciting, Hiding in Plain Sights, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic. I will introduce her in a second, and then she will give some remarks. Before I do that, just know that for anybody who has not been here, just to set the room off right, you can ask questions in the Zoom chat. You can raise your hand in the chat, or you can throw a question in the chat if you just want it read. Whichever way, we will get to your question. We'll have somebody looking for that. You can also ask questions if you're watching on YouTube. Somebody will be looking at the chat on YouTube so that you can throw your question in there, and we will make sure we get to you. You will get in the queue. And if you are watching and are following on Twitter, you can also use the hashtag Slaveryarchive, and we will be checking Twitter and checking that hashtag so that we can get to your questions. So plenty of ways to participate and be involved. So, Erika Edwards. Dr. Erika Edwards is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is the author of, as we see, Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, which won the 2020 Association of Black Women Historians Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize and was named one of the best books of 2020 by the African American Intellectual History Society. And as a member of ABWH, the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize is a very hard prize to get. So congratulations, Dr. Edwards. I am going to step back and let you take the floor, and we'll let you introduce the book and the work, and then we'll head into the conversation.
So, everyone hear me? Okay, good. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you so much to the hosts, Anna, Alex, Vanessa, and Jessica. This has been phenomenal, and I've enjoyed watching them on YouTube. And it's just, thank you so much for allowing various scholars from around the world to highlight their books. And so thank you so much. I know this is a lot of work. And I also want to thank you guys for really, especially Anna, I do have to give you a shout out again for really pumping the book when it came out. It's officially sold out, which is wonderful to hear. Yes, just as of yesterday, it sold out. The director of marketing let me know this. So thank you, all of you. Thank you. So very briefly, then I'll give you a little bit more about the book, how I came to the book, some of the interventions I'm trying to make. And then I really am looking forward to your questions and so forth in terms of for those of you that have read the book, your impressions and such. So to be frank, this was kind of a bit of a surprise in terms of where and how I even came to this topic. I had already done research in Argentina for 15 plus years. My dissertation was actually about Black experiences in Argentina, legal identities and how they go back and forth. And so that's where I was at. And I kind of was still working through that for the book. And it wasn't until the whole I wasn't say controversy, but the fact that it blew up about the fact that there was a lacking of Black players in the 2014 Argentine football team. And I was struck by it because I literally said to myself, why is this even a topic anymore amongst academic circles, and especially those that do Black history in Argentina? We've dealt with that and we've talked about why and how and the myths of disappearance. The first one coming out in 1980 with Reed Andrews. So I was thinking, where is this disconnect? Especially because, you know, we have these academics and we've been going on and talking about other things in terms of Blackness and questions of the Black experience in Argentina, but yet this is blowing up. And so I think at that point, then I stopped what I was working on and I said, well, here's a unique opportunity where I can ultimately attempt to engage that question in a historical setting and have that opportunity to really say the question really is historical, and what does it look like to go back in time when there was a clearly visible Black population, and how do we get to a point where people argue Argentina is a white nation? And so that's really, then I just started from scratch. I took what I had from my dissertation and dissected it and just started to look at these questions of race and racial identity and how possibly we get to that moment. And because I'd already worked on Cordoba for the dissertation, I decided to stay there. And I also stayed there because in general, what I wanted to do was give more of a, I shouldn't say give, but provide an analysis of Blackness outside of Buenos Aires. Still right now, when you look at the scholarship that's being produced about Blackness, the Black experience, it is 99.9% about BA. And so, you know, the dissertation was about Cordoba. So I said, I still want to deal with disappearance and the questions of Blackness and how do we get to this so-called white nation in Cordoba. And so with that, I also, you know, went back to Reed Andrews's book and I said, what else is, I wanted to provide then not so much a counterpoint, but a juxtaposition, because at least for me, I felt that his book was so pivotal in that question in the 1980s. How do we then get it more to today and other questions in terms of gender and topography, geography, all those, the hot topics that are kind of looming right now and bubbling right now. And so a couple things then that I did was I went back to Cordoba a few more times, and specifically then looking at and trying to understand this whitening or othering, as I'll talk about later, process. And I was shocked at the fact that the early 19th century had not really been interrogated to the point that other places or BA had been. And so I wanted to really look at early 19th century and what's going on, especially after you have these important legislation policies passed, such as the Free Womb Act. So what is happening at that moment? What is allowing for at the beginning of the 19th century to have a visible Black population, but then by the end of the 19th century, this so-called disappearance is happening. And so that's the other thing I had to do, is really then focus on this level of periodization. Let's go further back. How do we get there? And so that was one of the major interventions that I had, is to really talk about this transition then from colonial to republic. And I really stress republic. It's not national. Some people still want to use it. It's not. Cordoba was its own unique place. It declared independence in 1820 as its own republic, as well as other various republics throughout the Rio de la Plata. And I think that's important that we then treat it as such. Because when we do that, then we also start to see how race and Blackness is unique to its two specific areas, and the geography again comes into play, the culture comes into play. And that's important that we recognize that Blackness throughout Argentina is not homogeneous. And there's so many different factors that came into play in terms of understanding this transition, specifically in Cordoba. And one of the main ones that I found was how conservative and how traditional the city is, even today, but definitely back then. And so you see that you have this ecclesiastical presence that you definitely don't have in BA, especially during the early 19th century. The other important thing that I wanted to do, and also to somewhat juxtapose what it came out with Reed Andrews, but then also with Alex Baruchi's great book as well about From Shipmates to Soldiers, is to move beyond the masculine experience and really delve into what is she up to. And so that meant that I went back to my sources and I literally just was combing for her. Where is she? What is she doing? And again, it was almost like I did have to start over again to really make sure that I could see this trajectory along and within her sphere. And one of the things that came forward through these sources was how political the household became. And so looking at and rereading and understanding Michelle McKinley's Fractional Freedoms really put me on another course to say, aha. So I thank Michelle for her brilliant book. And what is this household? How is it politicized? Excuse me. What is it in terms of her body? All these different levels of political meanings and layers came forward as I started to look at the household. And that's why then I even, chronologically the chapters flow, but thematically, I really wanted to emphasize these characters that I found, these roles that I found consistently throughout the sources, the concubines, the wives, the mothers, and the daughters, all of which I felt were pivotal in our understanding of this, again, movement towards so-called whiteness. And so in the end, it becomes in many ways a history about the family. It becomes a history, a woman's history, a gendered history, but it also, the more I delve into the sources, became a political and a legal history. And I thought that was a different way to look at it via her experience. So seeing how she deals with, and of course, social history. So seeing how she deals with the law, at times in tandem, at times with tension, but still ultimately with various goals at hand. And in this case, it was how does she create a better environment and experience for not only herself, but for her children. And that's one of the key things I found as I continued to look at the sources, is it was almost as if it was a constantly collective experience that was happening. Rarely did I find an individual that, was looking to become free and then move forward. No, if she was becoming free, it was oftentimes after she freed her children. I thought that was very telling. Another thing that I found that was remarkable and almost emotional is how many pregnant enslaved women paid for their children's freedom. With the stipulation, if they die, this happens. If not, this happens. Some oftentimes conditional, but just the fact that they, and it was in their case 25 pesos to put forward in order to ensure that they were now free people. So all this kept coming forward, and the concubines, the cohabitation. I found this great, brilliant case study that was sitting in the Arzobispado. So it's about 500 pages. You get about maybe 50 of it for the book. I still want to work through it because it was such a juicy case study. about cohabitation. Then the other chapter where I looked at marriage dissent cases, this is something I actually learned from, I have to give credit to Alex Barucki, where really interrogating the source in a different way. So most people would have said, yes, we know about the royal pragmatic and such, but when I actually broke down the 30 or so cases that involved women accused of having mala sangre, and looked then not only at the verdict, but actually the tactic upon which, for those that were successful and allowed to marry, that's when I said, oh my goodness, this issue of a Browning or an Indian is coming forward. And it was because, again, these layers of breaking down the source material and the methodology I use, that's where that chapter came forward. And I think that was what made it also unique, possibly to Cordoba, is to have this Browning process take place, which I looked at again with the politicalization of her body in the following, the next chapter about motherhood, and those that claim that they were Indian in order to evade enslavement. But, seeing Browning as another way of whitening and essentially othering, I think was very telltale of the interior and again, unique, and one of those great opportunities we have when we move beyond what's already been discussed. And I'm not saying BA doesn't deserve continued attention, but this is one of those unique opportunities that I had. And then the last chapter was a surprise. I thought I was done. I thought I really was done with those 5. I said, okay, we got to move on. But I was inspired by a scholar who had told me, what you're looking at, you're not going to find anything. And I was like, okay, you'll see. And so that's kind of where I went with that, because I was like, when this scholar had told me that, what you're looking at is a little problematic, the question of education, you're not going to find anything. It's the early 19th century. There's nothing but wars going on. And I remember thinking, no, there's got to be something there. And there was, and there still is. And it's the School for Girls that was established in 1782 and created ultimately a segregated class for pardas. And that just blew my mind. And so I went back and said, I'm going to have one more chapter because this is amazing. And this segregated class existed through 1858. So 5 years after slavery was abolished, in Cordoba. And the school in itself exists still today. It's now open to both boys and girls. And so to be able to go there and to see the original, it's now a museum, but see the chapel, and on the ceiling of the chapel is a painting of 2 angels, one that is black and one that is white. So to be able to add that too and talk about what she meant then for the state and how she played also a pivotal role, this Republican motherhood, I thought was also necessary. So you see these various levels of how the household becomes politicized and her role specifically then in the making of this so-called white nation, especially by the end of the 19th century. And just to kind of close, I was kind of bummed at the end. I wanted some type of hero or something that just popped and said, bam, and, something did someone resist? Did I find anything? And for Cordoba, at this point, I just didn't. And so I said, it just, I didn't find, I guess, what I thought was going to be this major possible Black consciousness, maybe that's starting to develop that we see at the end of the 19th century in BA. No. And that's when I had to finally accept, and I hope it does come through the book, is that, at the end of the day, people's decisions are based off of the choices that are given to them. And in her case, it was a difficult decision, one in which oftentimes may result in her, completely having, as Allison Hobbs have noted, a chosen exile. But it was the decision that she had to make. And that level of adaptation and at times resistance, I think, is a powerful theme that we constantly see, that Black women are constantly part of that narrative throughout the Americas, throughout the Atlantic, throughout the world. And that, I hope, has come forward in the book. So I thank you for all that read the book, and I look forward to engaging with you. I hope.
No, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. The queues are open for questions, any questions you have. Again, you can put them in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can chat on YouTube. I am going to kick it off while questions come in. And so I have two questions because moderator privilege. One, wonder if you could talk a little bit. I mean, you have so many. This book is making so many interesting contributions to how we think about race in Latin America broadly, as well as how we think about race in Argentina, race, whiteness, blackness, indigeneity or indigenousness, whatever we want to think about how race is operating in that context. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you're thinking through this in terms of the kind of micro, like what's happening on the ground with the calidades, and how those, are reflecting a particular understanding of what race or racialization is. I mean, there seems to be a lot of conversation about that and what it means, and isn't always the same thing as a conversation about blackness, but is a conversation about how race operates, right? And how we're trying to figure that out in this world where, like, these places that were created by these empires are now coming together. So that's on the micro level, but on the bigger level, I wonder if you could talk, more broadly about the ways that you see this story of Argentina as, part of a larger whole. Like, are we to take or to think about this city, this region as exceptional, and how understandings of blackness and indigenousness, indigeneity emerge? Is it are there elements that are more similar to actually across Latin America into the Caribbean, maybe even into the U.S.? Like, what can we which side of sort of the equation do we want to place Argentina, or is it fair to even put it Argentina in a balance that way?
Great questions. So understanding the as you said, at the micro level, the calidades. One of the things I really wanted to do, and I'm glad also because I focused on women, I was able to really look at those daily interactions. What is life like, on the ground constantly? She was everywhere, first and foremost, and she did so many different things. And one of the things I kept seeing was, depending on who she was dealing with at the time, you could see that her calidad could change or would change. So at times, she could be a negra, and then at other times when necessary in India, or as we saw in the Republican period, a part of it. This is the same woman. So I think what it's showing us is that calidad was constantly in flux, especially at the end of the 18th century. It starts to harden, however, in the 19th century, especially when I looked at the census data, and I saw ultimately it was almost 50-50. You were either pardo or you were blanco or noble, because at that point, the word Spaniard, español, is a dirty word post-independence. During the post-colonial period. And so that was very telling. Also looking at the marriage records, and this is where I also saw levels of social mobility constantly happening, where I would find her born a slave, and then married at times, and now she's a mestiza or an India. And then this, her name was Teresa Sotelo. And then by 1814, she was outside of the city. Her first husband had died. She had remarried, and now she was a doña. And so you constantly see that this is creating this notion then of what it means to have levels of racelessness at times, and race and racial identity all coming forward. And it is very performative. I think that was key too. So as you know, one of my main characters, Bernabella, you know, if she was going to be the senora, she had to act like the senora, which meant she was going to demand that they bring her chocolate in bed, and that she was going to wear certain jewelry and you know, ride in the carriage, because that is, you know, who she was trying to emulate. So I think that was also key too, that this level of performance and having to constantly be reaffirmed by others of who you are, which in the end serves as a very interesting strategy to evade the law when necessary, and also to take advantage of it. Now, in terms of Argentina and its broader implications, one word I would love to get rid of in terms of race relations in Argentina is exception. I am done with Argentina being considered an exception to the rule. It is something that I am continuously having to work on, but I don't know what I found for the late 18th through early 19th century is telling of also what is happening throughout the larger Spanish Empire, and also to some extent the Portuguese. But especially one of the things that I found was, because I looked at Cordoba became more of a telling and representative story than BA. If anything, BA is the anomaly, because it explodes out of nowhere from this backwater, you know, place that used to, you go there for contraband, and now all of a sudden it's the capital, right, of the royalty for the Rio de la Plata. And instead, Cordoba and the rest of the Rio de la Plata continue to be very much these kind of small, insular, interior cities. So what is that telling us? So in terms of Argentina, I think actually Cordoba is the standard. But again, looking beyond what is today Argentina, elements, specifically the idea of indio, I think is something that's been found in New Orleans, for example, in terms of how there are some, I forget who wrote a book or something about that, but this issue a few years ago of, you know, with Black women claiming or claims of levels of indigenous identity. I think also there was one in Virginia as well. I think it was Ariela Gross that possibly wrote that, but she had a few examples in terms of looking at Black women in the question of Blackness and indigeneity. But then also today, I think of the Dominican Republic, where everybody is Indio, nobody is Black. So you see kind of this present day notions of what is considered to be othering. And I question, is that because, you know, when you claim levels of indigenous identity, is that for those that could not pass as white? I question that as another tactic to move beyond Blackness. So no, Argentina is not, and especially my book, is not an exception. Instead, it's really showing very much so how this is, you know, a Spanish American story that is taking place in Argentina. And it allows for us to see the beginnings of what would eventually be this Blanqueamiento experience, which also took place throughout throughout Latin America.
Thank you. Up next, we have Tatiana Cejas. Cejas? ¿Cuál?
Hi.
Hi.
I love your book so much.
Oh, thank you.
Many reasons. First, I have to applaud you for your brevity. Thank you for writing a book that I just sat down and read through without stopping. You can do so much with clear, concise writing. So thank you for that. My question is more about Cordoba. So the last time Cordoba had crossed my mind, truly, was in graduate school when I read Carlos's work, Asudarian. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. Carlos Asudarian. I'd read his work because I found it very inspiring to look at notarial, at property records. Right? I was thinking, how am I going to get to my story? And the city itself isn't very present in Carlos's work, right? So when I read your introduction, right, how you describe Cordoba, and then you point out information like how small of a city it was. There aren't that many people. It's a tiny ciudad. And that informed how I read the rest of the stories about how everybody knew everybody, right? And so I wondered if you could just tell us some more about what Cordoba must have felt like on the ground, where you would have known everybody that crossed your path almost, and how you imagined this late 18th and 19th century Cordoba when you were there, when you've gone back, what places today continue to spark your imagination for imagining this past?
Great question. Yes, Carlos's work actually really helped me situate the early Cordobese experience in history. I especially, I think it was now his book is very small. His examination of the slave trade was especially illuminating. When I just thinking off the top of my head, him going through all those notarial records, finding a Japanese slave, which I then traced back, and I found a little bit more information about where he ended up going, which was his next stop was to Chile, which was really cool. But yeah, so I definitely think his work really helped me set the tone for understanding also the inter-American slave trade that was taking place in Cordoba. But you're right. I mean, he just kind of delves into the notarial records and it doesn't leave us with this notion of realizing how tiny Cordoba is. And today it's the second largest city, but back then it was so small and it remains small. You're looking at about 7,200 at the end of the 18th century. And then the last city census that's available to us, 1840, you're looking at maybe 13,000. So the city stays pretty much the same. And so does the actual layout. Okay, so you've got this kind of 7x10 terraza that's happening, and it's amazing to think about what that meant for people that lived throughout the city. And what I think was happening is everyone knew everyone or knew of someone, but I would think also this notion of surveillance. Everyone's always watching you and knowing what you're up to and constantly. And that's important to stress because we're also, when I look at it, it's during the late 18th century. So this is the edicts of good governance that come forth. The alcaldes now are being put in place throughout the city, and they are watching to see what is happening. Constantly levels of social control is being put forward to deal with potential problems, problematic people in many ways, making sure people know their place and their space constantly. That was happening all the time. And even when you look at the edicts, you know, you get whipped if you're Black, or enslaved if you're caught for vagrancy, for example, and you don't have your papeles of trabajo. Those are the type of things that were just constantly there. So I just think that you're constantly just like, who's watching me, when and why. And I would oftentimes see, you know, when people, they constantly had to go to, you know, the sierras to evade detection. That was one of the things I noticed with a lot of the criminal court cases that I looked at. And eventually they would be caught, but that's where they would go in order to have levels of privacy, especially if they were accused of committing a scandal. What makes Cordoba very unique today, though, is the downtown historic area is the exact same thing.
Oh, okay.
It's amazing. So as I opened up with chapter 1, at the time, the provincial archive was 3 blocks away from the Plaza Major, which was the original Plaza Major, the main plaza that was created in the 16th century. And so to be able to sit there and just see the original Cabildo and the cathedral that are in the same spot, of course, they've been built upon and dealing with levels of having to renovate it. But to be able to see that, or to go to what's called the Jesuit block, where you see where, you know, parts of the original university, which was founded in 1613, is still there. The Colegio de Montserrat, the first, you know, high school for boys, they are still attending classes in that building today. The law library, for, you know, all that is still there. And then you literally go, you know, right next to it, and it's a McDonald's. So it's different in that sense to have that kind of juxtaposition. But I felt like it was alive still. You could still, and that's one of the things that just amazed me. I was thinking, you know, these magnificent structures, you know, built by hand and built by brown and Black hands, but where are they represented, you know? And that's where I kept thinking that they're hidden in plain sight when I think of all of them. Or there's this place called Altagracia where you can go to one of the original Jesuit estancias, and you see, you know, how they lived. It's just, yeah, it's amazing. And I think that also helped in the writing process, when I would just go and sit and think about, you know, these are the same place where so many different people walked and experienced and labored, enslaved and tribute, and just all that coming together. It was at times it was moments of real serenity when I thought about what I was writing, and to be able to connect that. I think that's also what makes Cordoba unique.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. Who is up next? I see Alex. Jump on in.
I thank you for this wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it a lot, and I read it with a mission, because I'm Dominican, so I was already reading it, you know, super biased for trying to find perhaps some of our own historical phenomena. You know, there's a lot more differences there. You know, there was after emancipation, there was a ruralization that takes place. There's also the sort of definition by counter definition when the country separates from Haiti, unification, etc. Right. So there's, but I did find some similarities there in the sort of like instead of running away from assimilation, completely in the other direction of consciousness, to like not run exactly in the opposite direction as some kind of manifestation of agency. And I'm thinking here though of a turn in several of the recent books that I've seen, including Jessica's book, Wicked Flesh, where we see it's a tightrope. It's a complex argument about agency, about the agency of Black women in particular, that has Black women sort of like, it's hard to, yes, there are no heroes, but it's also hard not to see that there's something heroic there. In like fighting for your kin, right? And like and trying to make it through. Sorry, please ignore this this creature, please. So So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this, because I think it's an uncomfortable form of agency for us in our generation, right? But to the way it sits with us, but I'm sure it's more than just like dealing with anti-heroes, you know. So if you could say a little bit more about that, if my question is clear, I hope it is.
Well, if I'm not, please, jump in and help me out. So, and I guess maybe anti-hero, and maybe it did come off a little too harsh. I do think it is very powerful, and I do think it's very telling of what Black women have done and continue to do in terms of what they're willing to do for their family. That is definitely very powerful. And that comes forward consistently throughout the text. Risk, levels of banishment, risk this, when, for example, one of the women who's walking through and she's already married, but she's dressing above her station, so to speak, her status, so to speak, and she's stripped literally in the middle of the street, for embarrassment. I can only imagine what that would have been like, but this notion that she had to do this level of performance, I think is very powerful. So yeah, I guess it's important to stress what she's willing to do, and also the context in which she's in. This isn't 20th century, 1960s, the notion of Black consciousness coming forward. There isn't the Black press like we see in Buenos Aires. So what does she have as an option? And in her case, it was these levels of resistance that could also be very adaptive, right? She's not able to, the Sierras do not have the same level of coverage, such as, some areas where you could have marronage, for example. But she can have that ability to find a way to legally, change the status of her children if she can get them to be baptized, or noted in the book of baptisms for Españoles, right? And forever change their trajectory in life. There are ways in which if she can claim and find means to become Indio, she can no longer have to deal with enslavement. And so when I looked at that one case in which she fought for her, not only herself, but it was for her children and then her grandchildren. So 3 generations of potentially enslaved peoples became free by 1817 because she claimed it and constantly talked about and showed this level of genealogy that, we had always served in the household, but we were always free. My mother is from the Pampas. That was often what they always argued, the Pampas, Christianized at that, and a cacique in certain levels too. But I think that was also important. So working within also the law. And finally, I think this is one thing that we haven't really looked at in Latin America is this education, the educating process. And how she specifically serves a very important role in that process. Republican motherhood has been well documented and discussed, especially in the United States, but that was very telling to me that they specifically then made this PARTA class, which included not just African descendants, but also indigenous girls, over time. And what does that tell me is not so much, obviously the issues of segregation are there, but also that then she played some certain role in the terms of creating this new, republic and this notion of what would be the nation later on. I think, I guess it's different in the terms that you're not seeing what most people may want to, this BA kind of conversation, but it's what is Cordoba, and what they're willing to do as mothers and wives, daughters and concubines. It's their story, and I had to make sure that it was told correctly, and recognizing again, people make decisions based off of the choices that are given to them. And in this case, this is one way in which we're able to understand and see how Argentina then becomes supposedly a white nation.
I mean, actually, I'm going to jump in again. Because, you know, the conversation about Black women and like the negotiations they have to make, and the moves they have to make to create some space in slaveholding societies is such a logical and reasonable one to those of us who are doing this work, yourself and so many others. And yet, you know, sometimes like it can be received with pushback in the academy, or in, I mean, at least in my case, more rarely in the communities in which the work is being written. But, you know, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, you know, like what has the reception been to this, you know, reconceptualization of this history and of the exceptionalism, of the blanqueamiento, of race, of Black women's role, and sort of, you know, pushing against these barriers and manipulating them for their own purposes. How has the process of creating, what was the process of creating this book like?
Oh boy. Okay, so the process of creating this book, you know, it wasn't easy. It really wasn't, because she, you know, as we often say, for those of us that do Black women's history, you really have to at times read against the archive to find her, because she, you know, there's so many ways in which she's documented, sometimes without a name, sometimes it's just, you know, brief little snippets, versus her counterpart, male counterpart, which you just see constantly. So like I said, I had to start from scratch, in a sense, with the same sources I had, and really look at her and see where she was coming. Luckily, because I collected so much, and I think this is what allowed for me to really put the book together. I had, you know, went to the Arzobispado, I had the provincial archives, I had the archives from the university, and then I had the municipal archives, and then I had the archives from the school. I mean, there's so many archives in Cordoba, and I went to as many as possible. And that's how I was able then to find her. So there are these little snippets of my characters, and then be able to put her together to create a story. I mean, it took a lot of time. You know, the fact that I was able to transcribe all the census data, you know, for the 4 years that are available, really helped then, as I was able to see how she would become potentially parda, or become mestiza or blanca over time. That was also important too. So that's really what it was. It was literally just, okay, I found her. Oh, I found her again. Oh, I found her again. You know, the notarial records, I had all of them from 1776 to 1853, actually, in the probate records. And that was what took a lot of time, but I'm so happy I did that, because then I was able to really build this case and show, you know, they're not just these, you know, fun little stories, as you know, as all of us that are historians know, it's not like you pick up a document and, oh, there's the entire, there's her life written for you. No, you know, it's, there she is in the baptismal records, her marriage records, her, you know, descent records. And so that's what it was like, kind of like a puzzle, putting everything together. How it's been received, so far, so good. Overall, what I'm hearing from my colleagues in Argentina is that they are happy to know that it is about something other than Buenos Aires. So that was great to hear. But there's still some that are just kind of like, well, really, is this representative of really what happened? You know, these are fun vignettes. Maybe that's all it is. But overall, I am impressed with the positive feedback that I've received. Some people, I think, just still continue and almost, I had one person who found it a bit offensive, and no, that's not the case. You're making it seem like, you know, they wanted to argue more of a victimization and the myth of all Black men dying, and that's what's happening. She's not, this choice that she has is not a choice at all. So that was probably the only thing that's been kind of hurled at me in terms of not agreeing with my argument. But again, I've been very impressed by how many people have just enjoyed reading the book. And I've heard a lot of people saying how much they've learned from the book. And I think that's the ultimate goal is if someone can walk away from the book and say, yeah, I've learned something different about Argentina. I've got a few Argentines that have written me individually and told me thank you, that when they read the book, they started to think about how history had been taught, and they had never really thought of you know, how flexible calidad was. Or some would even write me and say, you know, in my family, I have this, you know, lo negro, you know, the dark one, or I always heard about this potential of someone being of African descent. So they were really appreciative of the story. So, and the narrative, I should stress.
Nice. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Because the way that we end up creating these books can be just as important as the actual like text that gets created. And so it's actually really good to hear that this narrative is getting received well, like on the ground in this moment, especially.
Well, and I just to continue with that, I really wanted to make sure that I engaged Argentine scholarship. And I think for those of us that do scholarship outside of the, as visitors, you know, and foreign scholars of the various countries that we visit and study, it is pivotal that we engage with them. With the scholars on the ground. And so even I made a conscious effort in my bibliography to know as many as possible, all of the great scholarship that has come out, because it's another thing I constantly hear from people is Argentine scholars haven't been doing this work. And I'm like, yes, they have. You know, there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I, you know, so I wanted to make sure that I privileged in many ways some of the work that I've built on, you know, Florencia Guzman, who I ended up co-authoring a chapter with, and Monica Giardi. Those are two that have really influenced my work and helped me as I continued along. Chichina Ferreira, another person who actually, after I was back in the United States, continued to send me documents, you know, thank goodness, so I could finish chapter 6. So yeah, and the archivists too are great. So it is important, and I think we have a certain responsibility to make sure that we are always cognizant of the fact that we are visitors in their country, and we should and must continue to tell their history in a very respectable way. So
thank you. That's phenomenal. We have a question in the chat. Alicia Hall is asking if Professor Edwards could talk about the public versus the private and the way the two are intersecting in this process as different relations were recognized.
okay, well, Alicia, thank you for that great question. And I think that was one of the advantages of looking at her, is that you have, again, the politicalization and an understanding of the household that shows that it's not a closed off space, but instead it's very much an opportunity and a window to look at the public within the private sphere, and the private at times within the public sphere, depending on what view you have. But clearly what becomes evident to me is that this is a very open society. And because of the fact that it's such a small city, you're constantly going to have this back and forth to the point where these spaces of public and private will be blurred on a consistent basis. So I think one of the things too that again, specifically looking at the moment that I'm studying the end of the 18th century with these edicts of good governance, which is ultimately an attempt similar throughout all of Spanish America to, part of the Bourbon reforms to kind of revitalize the economy, but also get some level of social order back intact, because, Haiti had just happened and we don't want another Haiti, or in Tupac Amaru had happened. We definitely don't want that. So you're seeing their ability to infiltrate into these private spheres from the top down. And I think that's also important to stress. So you have, for example, sumptuary laws that are coming forth now dictating what is happening to yourself and to your person, that explicitly state as policies, mulatas and negras, right, cannot do the following. And that I think was very powerful, that they named them specifically, or excuse me, Sobremonte, not they, Sobremonte's edicts named them specifically as not allowing them to wear certain garments and articles of clothing and jewelry. Another aspect I think that was very important is the education. And that is, again, something that we have not as scholarship really delved into, but it's the end of the 18th century. It actually begins in Spain, right? These school for girls, and recognizing that she plays an important role in terms of motherhood. It then comes over with, San Alberto, who starts this school. He's a clergyman, I forget what rank, but he comes to Cordoba and he begins that process where he wants to then target these orphans and ultimately deal with the household, again, suggesting that what is there is not enough. So not only are they going to be orphans, but we're also going to have this external class, right? These commuter class that will come forward and also get a better education, because again, there's a slippery slope between what is private and what is public, and their attempts to create an ideal motherhood ultimately infiltrates the private sphere through various policies that come forward. And it's this constant back and forth that is happening. I think that's also what makes it very powerful in terms of recognizing, again, that it's not this kind of strict or like inside outside type of dichotomy. Instead, they're oftentimes together and mixed, and it depends on what the circumstance is that would allow for you either to be public or private within the household.
Sorry.
I hope. Yes.
I was asking if I could ask like a little follow-up. I'm sorry I don't have my camera on. I'm actually like running around. But I was wondering if you see any attempts by the women to, I don't know, mitigate this incursion into the private, or is it just the desire to have their children in a better place, overriding maybe trying to like stop that at all? Does that make sense as a question?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm gonna try it. So what I think is important, yes, the answer is yes. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to be responsible, that this ability to, adopt levels of whiteness was not always available to all women and African descended women. So I also documented these failed attempts as well. So yes, there were moments in which they would try to mitigate that or strategize, or ways in which they were not trying to deny their Blackness. But that's usually like situations in which I found then whatever they were seeking. For example, there was a really great case study in which this Maria de la Cruz was with this priest, almost similar to Bernabella. They have kids together, the constant promise of giving her freedom. Eventually she doesn't get it, so then she goes to court. But who goes to court for her actually is her mother. And her mother, who is, ultimately is trying to have her become free. But in the end, what she ends up doing is she ends up representing herself, which she's not allowed to do. She then also, goes to the wrong court. Instead of sticking within the church, she goes to the secular court system, which is another thing she's not allowed to do. And she gets chastised for it and almost, reprimanded for just even attempting to represent herself in such a way. And it's those types of situations. I think that's, if not, please correct me if I'm wrong, but those are those moments where you do see that, yes, there are women that attempted to come forward despite all the odds, but they're not going to get, or at times, it's just, at least the book is showing, they're not receiving the same type of freedom versus someone who would then be claiming that they were indigenous, in which in all the cases that I saw, they eventually were able to become free and declared indigenous. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well, as I worked my way through the source material. I hope that answered it.
Thank you. We had a hand up from Emily Lockwood. I don't want to miss your question if you had one.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on the conversation after Professor Edwards was talking about the relationship between like professors and researchers in Argentina and then like coming into as American. This has been so interesting listening to this conversation because I'm Argentine American, but I'm an undergrad student, so I can see like the academic, and then I also know like what it's like for my family back in Argentina. But I just wanted to say that this has been a really interesting conversation, like for me, from all of these intersecting lenses. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Yay, thank you so much. We have next Ana Lucia Araujo.
Hello, Erika. Then my question, I have two sort of questions. I think that the kind of book that you wrote, we need this kind of book, and I understand that people, they never challenge when historians are writing books that deal only with São Paulo or Buenos Aires or Mexico City, but they are claiming that this is the entire country, when it's not the case. And then when you start focusing on other regions that perhaps are more in the margins, this is also challenged. And this is something that we see, for example, for Brazil, and an element here, of course, because I come from Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, then that region is much more similar to the reality that you describe, that we study here in your book, than the reality of people living in Rio de Janeiro in the 19th century. Because it was late colonization as well, and so on. Tatiana, she brought the fact that Cordoba was a tiny city, but today Cordoba is the second city in Argentina, and I think that the third one after is Rosario, but Rosario also founded then at the late 18th century, similar to some cities that we have in Rio Grande do Sul. And I would like to know two things. First, if the work that you did here in Cordoba, there are elements that you could see that are similar in regions, perhaps in other smaller cities, in Rio de la Plata, or even then in the south of Brazil, that is part of this region as well. The other question is that many people, when you were disseminating the information about the book, they emphasized this image, the image on the cover. And you do not use, then in the book of visual images is not then the object of your analysis, but I would ask you if in your archival research, then more about the 19th century, and if you found then, if visual images, I would say not only then illustrations, in travel accounts or artworks, or even photography, how rich this archive is in the case of Argentina, for studying Black Argentinians or Black women in Argentina and in the region that you are looking at. Then I am curious about the existence of these visual sources and if they are rich or not.
Great, thank you, Anna. Yeah, one of the things definitely, and just to reemphasize, Cordoba to me, again, is more representative of what is happening on the ground, late 18th, early 19th century, than BA, which is kind of this metropolis explosion that's happening. And instead, what you're seeing with Cordoba, and especially if you go through the, the northwest part of what is today Argentina up through Potosi, and to some extent, even I would say Paraguay, the first and foremost, you see the similarities of the church and a very conservative culture that develops over time. The Jesuits and their strength and their power, especially for Cordoba and Paraguay, the estancias that also existed, those are all, parts of kind of creating this very rural at times, but rural and urban at times, small cities that were created throughout the course of the colonial period. Another thing that I think that is important to stress is the economy and how there's various levels of shared economy experiences as well. The mule trade being one of them that again, is all the way up through Potosi, which is important. And, the slave trade that also happens throughout the region. All those then create kind of this rustic but very small town kind of feeling. Again, where Cordoba at the same time is known as the Docta, because of the fact that you have such an intellectual hub there throughout the colonial period. So that is a little bit different than the rest of what is today Argentina. But I think that is what it was key for me, is to, as I continued to write the book, I wanted to, and realizing how different it was, it may have been different to BA, but it wasn't to other places. And I think that's important. And that's, again, one of the things that I've received in terms of positive feedback, was the fact that I'm shining a light, and hopefully there'll be more. I'd love to see something on Mendoza, Salta, Jujuy, all these places, especially Potosi. Most recently, there's been some more work on the actual slaves that went to Potosi, and acknowledging that there were more children than we thought of before that went to Potosi to work in the mines, which is heartbreaking. But it's necessary that we continue to see these connections. And we see then also how culturally conservative, especially when we look specifically at what is Argentina during the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata period, they are the ones that kind of come together, against BA. And you see this constantly back and forth, and even the development of what is known as the interior today is still very strong. This back and forth between los porteños, or those from BA, versus those that are from what they call the interior is can be at times very tense. As far as the cover of the image, that's a great question. So this visual took 2.5 years for me to find, because for those that have done work in Argentina, they oftentimes have to go with a casta painting from Mexico. And I said, no, I am not putting a casta painting of Mexico on the cover of a book that is about Argentina. So I'm going to find something somewhere. So it was actually, this was found in John Carter Brown library. And it took a lot of, one by one. And so I found this painting, and it is actually from Buenos Aires. I was not able to find any. Well, I'll get back to that in a second. So this is actually of a woman and her servant, as they said. Never said if she was a slave or not. And they are headed to church. And I just, for the chapter on Bernabella, I put it in there again, just to show that juxtaposition. And there's something powerful to me about her, where she's standing, kind of unassuming, very much, to me, most likely her enslaved, but again, they said her servant. And it is just something, and there's a bit of a smirk that she has that I thought was quite powerful. Versus, the woman here, the white woman who's, all look at me and I'm all dressed up nice and I've got my headdress and everything. There was just something about how she was dressed and very, very humble. And I kept thinking, here's a good image of someone who is literally right there all along, kind of hiding in plain sight. And so that's why in the end, and I'm so happy the press agreed to use this image. There was another image that I did find in Cordoba, but it was from 1894. And so I didn't want to go that far into the future per se. At least this was still within the time frame of what I was working with. But in general for Cordoba, I did not find a lot of visual, at all, which was disappointing. Most of it, I think it's still mainly BA, and they have a lot of great visuals. They've got the press, they've got a lot of good stuff to work with. But no, we did not have the casta paintings. We, meaning Argentina, doesn't have casta paintings like Peru and Mexico. So I still wanted to at least be within my time frame. So I did have to rely on BA for the cover, but I still think it's a powerful image.
We have Jennifer Spear is up next.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Erika. I've so enjoyed reading this book. It parallels a lot of the research and the issues that I've dealt with in my work on New Orleans, and same kinds of sources. And I could have dozens of questions that I could ask you about this, but I want to focus on one you mentioned, the plentiful sources that you had to deal with. And you also mentioned earlier Ariela Gross's work. And I think it's a really interesting conversation that's beginning to happen about those of the kinds of sources and the depth of them that those of us that work on the Spanish Americas have in exploring these questions compared to those in Anglo-America, which they don't have the notarial records, they don't have the sacramental records, the court records are so much sparser. And actually it was Michelle McKinley that sort of made this comment on the new book by Ariela and Alejandro de la Fuente on Becoming Free, Becoming Black. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had sort of, reading the books and articles that explore these questions in Anglo-America, and how different they are from the kinds of stories that you're able to recover, and whether this might actually help us to explore more Alexander's question about agency, right? And that the source materials are just so much richer for Spanish America to really delve into this question of what choices women of African descent were making.
So just kind of talk a little bit more about the source material. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you...
Well, in terms of the sacramental records and the notarial records, which I didn't see you use so much, but the court, I mean, you mentioned the court case with the bishop and I'm forgetting her name, sorry. But you said it was, hundreds of pages of long, right? An Anglo-American court record would probably be half a page. Right, with just a very terse summary of what went on and not the entire explanations and all of that. So, but I was just wondering if you've, sort of see this as a difference in the Anglo-American literature or the literature on Anglo-American colonies.
Oh yeah, definitely. And thanks for the clarification. Yeah, so my sources in general, it was a blessing in disguise because let me see, 1, 2, 3. I believe I was the third American that they had visit the archive in Cordoba. So they were actually pretty impressed and happy to even know that somebody was interested. And to be frank, I did hit the gold mine for Cordoba. And not only were they there, but the condition was amazing. And that definitely helps, because there's no point if you have a bunch of sources and they've been ruined because, you know, of water, or, you know, can't be found because of the fact that they weren't categorized correctly. So I do have to stress, I know that I was in a very unique position because I found the complete run of notarial records, of probate records, they have them, I should say, for the full 18th and 19th century, for all 4 sections of the city. I mean, it's amazing. So yeah, I definitely wanted to make sure I used those sources to continue to really delve into her daily life. And especially when I looked at, the probate and the notarial records in terms of her and owning her property, and at times even owning slaves, I thought that was very powerful to continue that conversation. So see, yeah, you know, with that, I think that is one of the advantages in general that we have for those that study, and I want to stress even more so the colonial period of what is Spanish America and the Spanish American experience, is the fact that we had this church that documented, you know, love them or hate them, documented everything. You know, the Inquisition court cases, you know, allow for us, you know, and allow for scholars to now look at and understand homosexuality and what does that look like because of those that were accused of it, and they kept it all. And in my case, like I said, just to recognize and see her business dealings throughout the city was impressive. So, you know, one of the things, I haven't really delved into the Anglo archives in any shape or form, but I do recognize that is an advantage that we have. And so I would actually suggest that we as Latin Americanists continue to do that work to shine and showcase the Black experience, because let's be frank, more of them went to Latin America than they went to the United States. But yet we're still, you know, the US narrative still is a dominant narrative, right? In terms of our understanding, especially in the United States, of what was the enslaved experience throughout the Americas. You know, Blackness in the United States just continues to be the dominant conversation. But one of the things that I, you know, again, because I'm not familiar with these sources, suggestions, possibly the census data, I don't know how they're recorded. Maybe that might be a way to go about it. I also question in terms of looking at, looking at the court cases. You said that they're oftentimes very short, but are you allowed, or at least do you at least get the verdicts to understand where, you know, what ultimately was the decision? Maybe that would be another way. I honestly, I don't feel like I should be giving you, of all people, suggestions anyways. Your stuff is brilliant. But yes, I guess I do. I want to acknowledge that there's definitely a difference. And possibly
it's less about you doing primary research, but just the scholarship that people are.
Yeah, I was going to say what I would like to see more of is a comparative conversation. And I think that's what I think is lacking amongst those of us that do, you know, colonial period. I think that there's a lot more in common with the Spanish and the British experiences, especially amongst those that are enslaved, where I talk about Ariela Grosses, and she was the one to also see this Black to Indian, and I'm saying Black to Indian. Why aren't we having more of a conversation about that? Why aren't we seeing this beyond, you know, just a US or an Argentine narrative, and recognizing what this means in terms of of race making and racial identity that comes forward, especially during the colonial period? That's what I think would be a way to really enrich our conversation even more so.
Ooh, thank you so much for that. We have a question from the chat. Alexander Holmes Brown asks, how many families might be surprised at their own roots today? How many folks have a grandmother, even someone close to them generationally, who is or was someone who struggled and moved through that changing racial hierarchy, definitions, opinions? You mentioned 50-50 Blanca Parda census at independence, but that's a huge percentage on either end. So if you could speak to that.
Wow. Okay. How many may be surprised? I think a lot. So just let's be honest. So we had recently the 2010 census that came forward that only showed less than 1% that considered themselves to be African descendants in Argentina. But that has now been critiqued on many levels, that in some cases, some parts of the country didn't even receive that question on their census, the sheet to fill out. But there has now been genetic testing that is happening, which is very interesting to see. And for an area, I believe it was BA, I forget what public hospital, but for the sample size that they had, they found surprisingly about 4% of the people, when they looked at their DNA, appear to have African ancestry. 37% had indigenous ancestry. And that's another question of, there are no Indios as well in Argentina. So yeah, I do think that people would be, if they shook their family tree, they'd be shocked at what would fall out. Definitely, there's no doubt about it. I think it's also important to stress, this is part of that kind of othering process that I touch on a little bit in the book. And as you mentioned, this 50-50 Parda Blanca, population that comes forward. Pardos were African descendants, were indigenous peoples, mestizos, mulattos, zambos. I traced them through the census data. And I found them, earlier in 1778 or 1813 as something else versus, 1832, which is the last census that provides racial categories. That was shocking to me. But in each case, by 1822 and then 1832, you're looking at almost 50% of these pardos, of these othering, the browning possibly that is taking place. And I think it's a first step then towards the ultimate whitening process that happens at the end of the 19th century. And so for many, I think, yes, they would be shocked to find out. But for a lot too that recognize that, as they're known today as many morochos, they know that they're not coming off of that European boat per se, or they may know of someone, but there's another side to their family as well that is suggesting a more darker experience, whether that be African descent or indigenous descent. So yeah, definitely they would be shocked, but it's necessary to, and this is one of the scholarship is where it's headed right now, and I myself am interested in interrogating this use of negro for those that aren't technically of African descent in Argentina, to kind of get at, how do they deal with the fact that you're either blanco or you're something else. That's also something I'm starting to interrogate as well.
Thank you. We have a question from YouTube and some great comments. What a great book. My question is about, the question is about your approach to fashion. Oops, sorry, I just lost it. Fashion and clothing. Do you consider fashion and clothing in relation to practices like veiling, in other words, work by Laura Bass on earlier centuries, and or the presentation of race and gendered bodies? Thank you. Oh, and also part of this question is thinking about other parts of the Hispanic world as well.
So, one of the things that I enjoyed when I decided to look at clothing, and specifically the issue of sumptuary laws, was to really interrogate what is material culture and how that also plays a very important role in how bodies are racialized. and how that also plays into your supposed, I guess we should say, your supposed calidad. And I think that was very important as I continued to do the work and look at the ways in which, certain women are allowed to wear this and certain women are allowed to wear that. I didn't really think much about the veils per se. I looked at it more from a legal framework. And what does this mean in terms of how she's able to ultimately climb out of, or levels of social mobility? Is that available to her or not? And of course, and to be responsible, I think it only really worked for those that were already passable. Bernabella, for example, they were already complaining about her, looking like a Spanish woman. So this ability to kind of then dress the part and, provide her best performance is what was the most troubling, because it was working. And if they didn't know previously that she had been a slave, she would have been able to, ultimately transform herself, and as well as her daughter, and become then, the senora. So I think that's the way I'm looking at clothing and material culture, is just, again, how the body becomes then what is personal, but then also public. If we were to think about what I previously talked about, and this kind of back and forth of what that means, the way that they're able to project what they want people to see, and also the way people see them. I think that back and forth is very powerful.
Great. Well, we have time maybe for.
I have a follow-up if
Okay.
anybody, yeah. So I have a question that sort of hits on some of the things that have already been asked, because it seems to me that, a current that runs through a lot of the ways that racial identity formation happens all over the Atlantic world, that it comes back to what you can see. And even if it is in a society in which people are doing the sorts of Enlightenment racial taxonomy, sort of literally what you can see, the language around race is the language of the visual. It comes back to color, and using terms around color and status that relate the two. And so I am sort of wondering, leaning on the question that was just asked, what are people seeing? And in what ways does the fact that this is such a small town, that even when someone is saying, no, what you're seeing is this, when you look at me, is there a bit more of a dance going on here around, I know what I can see, but I'm really invested in this system of power working in this way. So I'll go ahead and let you get away with it. Versus, no, I really feel strongly that I've got to stand up. I'm really interested in the kind of messiness of those lines, because, like you say over and over again, we're dealing with real people in real space and time, and often generations of people who do know each other and can see each other.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely. So in other words, I see you as, your pigment being darker, and how much can you actually claim than levels of whiteness or indigeneity, and what does that look like, and how is that working? It's complicated, as Vinny would say. And I think in the case of these women here in Cordoba, it is very clear from the very beginning, if we just look at a broader sense of what is calidad and what does it mean, especially on the ground for such a small town, is you have, by especially the end of the 18th century, a population where the majority of them are considered non-white. Okay. And so it is imperative for them, even from the beginning, not so much, but especially towards the end of the 18th century, that they make a clear distinction between what is and who should have privilege and status, versus those that do not. And that, is something that has been talked about by various, Susan Sokolow has talked about this, Monica Giardi has talked about this. The white population, which is in the minority, always acted as if they were under siege, and like, what's going to happen next? We don't want them to ultimately come together. And so that's this kind of underlying current that is happening. And so a couple things. So I think that is why for those that would attempt to become indigenous, that became an actual very successful way in which they could claim it, and then also claim it for generations based, of course, on a law from the 16th century. But it was still like an ability for you to get your freedom, but you're still not going to be able to have access to true privilege and status. I think that was very clear when I read these court cases for those that claim to have indigenous ancestry. For those that wanted to or attempt to become Spanish, this is where, phenotype really played a role. And I'm not going to deny that. That's why I even, preface Bernabella's light skin, which is very clear in what they're talking about. That is what allows for her to transcend. But I also want to be, transparent that she was a success story until she got caught. But there are also many mulattos blancos that existed in the archive. And I think that is very telling. Yeah, so you would see that, or blanco con pelo crespo, they would say. So you still see their ability to try and say they're still not quite white, or make sure that it is, noted that he is still a mulatto, he's just the color blanco. So I think that was also what allows for, as you said, Vanessa, this level of messiness that is constantly happening. And another thing too that I found is that it wasn't always the transition to whiteness that could occur per se in the city. It was oftentimes they would go to an interior town somewhere outside of Cordoba, where you would then find them living white or living indigenous. And then eventually coming back to the city after a few years, and then that allowed for that transition to continue. So I think it's also important to stress, yes, in Cordoba, the city was very much very, very hierarchical. Like I said, you have your mulattos blancos, but that you would have, people like Bernabella, but Bernabella also only came forward because the priest demanded it. Her lover demanded it and provided that level of protection. So we see how gender is also coming into play. He demands that the slaves call her senora. He demands that she, wears certain garments, and that, he's going to the front door when he should have been going to the back door, like everybody knows, right? Those are the types of things that are constantly also at play. And I think that's important to stress too. She's not acting alone. For those that can actually become white or ascribe to whiteness, that is not something that oftentimes they can do individually without the assistance of others. So I think that's also important too. For those that would attempt to do it in our individuals, oftentimes they fail. They just don't have the social networks that some other women had in order to get that level of whiteness.
I would have I don't know if is there any questions in the chat or elsewhere? Nobody?
No, ma'am. You are up if you have one.
Oh. Okay, then Erika, I just want to ask, because I don't know if anybody else has a question at this point, but what is the project that you'll be working then after this book? If you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I presented this at Northwestern a couple weeks ago, and it's still, at the very beginning, but it's this othering process that's taking place as early as the early Republican period. My question I have is, how does it? So let me back up, because again, something in popular culture came forward, and that's what's propelling me in another direction. When Maradona died, I was talking to some of my Argentine friends, and they had mentioned that he, in many ways, was their Malcolm X. And I just went quiet, because I said, huh, that's different. That's very different. Do tell is what I ended up having to ask them. And they said, well, you know, for us negros, which this person wasn't, but for us negros in Argentina, he represented something more. He was our hero. He was us. He was us at the national level. You know, that is what means so much to me. And I've been stuck at that process, because wow, you know, the Malcolm X. And so long story short, I've been just doing more digging about this racialization of the word negro and how it is applicable and very, very much to those that are not considered of African descent. And what does that look like? And what does that mean? And as I continue to do that type of work, I'm becoming more and more uncomfortable with describing Argentina as a white nation, and instead describing it more as an anti-Black nation, and anti-Black in terms of the Blackness and this attempt to constantly escape it, you know, starting from levels of enslavement versus free, Pardo versus Negro, but yet keeping that word to then ultimately become an othering process. So either you're Blanco or you're Negro, or another word that they would try and use like Criollo or Morocho or something else to say you're not white. And so that's what I'm working through. So it's going to be more of a cultural history, which is very different for me. I love my numbers and I love the grittiness of the social history, but it's going to be more of a cultural, intellectual history as I ponder what's going on here.
Well, this is wonderful project. Then I'm glad that you let us know about it. I don't know if there are any questions. Jessica, you are the ball with.
Hi. I wanted to know if I could just add a comment. Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, and what it was reminding me of in a similar contrast regarding, I guess, the Confederados in Brazil. When you think about after the Civil War of whites wanting to really, immigrate to recreate post-Civil War, and the question about like how many would be surprised to find out that they had Black ancestors. I myself, as a Black woman, I personally don't believe that they would be surprised. I think that's more of a pretension of like, let's pretend that we are surprised, when actuality, as a Black woman, the conversations that I've been in, I frequently will say to Latinos, we know who your great grandmother is, even if you want to pretend that you don't. The one though with the big hips and the kinky hair at the nape of her neck, we know who she is, even if you hide that picture. Thank you.
That's a really good observation. And I do, to some extent, for some that are older, and maybe that's another thing we need to look at is the generations. For those that are a little bit older that may know of their grandparents that were of African descent, I do believe that in many ways they probably do know. But because, and this is by the end of the 19th century, Blackness is so attacked, for many that are of African descent, they kind of go underground. And at one point, speaking to an African descendant of those that African descendant from slaves, because there were others that came Cape Verde and West Africa now, she had told me that in general, there was about 12 families that they knew of that could trace their roots back to those that were enslaved. So, and I say this because clearly by then, to think of the fact that you've got such a small number that still can even acknowledge that and know it. You think of the many that ultimately would let go of it because of shame, because of embarrassment. And it's not, and some of my friends would tell me, it's not until they spoke with their grandma or their grandpa that they would say, oh yes, my mother or my so-and-so was of African descent or indigenous descent. But in order for her to, fit into the family, this was from a personal friend, she had to leave and completely abandon her Indian family in order to fit into, her husband's family. So you see, there's a lot of that also took place as well. But I do think it may be more generational, because there's some that know and see and recognize they have the darkness, but may not be able to directly say yes, because I know of a great grandfather or so. But definitely, it's definitely there. And I'm glad that they're doing more genetic testing, which for some of them that probably got the genetic testing were shocked to find out that they did have some African ancestry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Any final questions, comments?
I'm sorry. I would just like to add that I would love to see more of these. This has been, the conversation is really needed. I know this had to do with Argentina, but it reminds me also of Cuba. Like there's not enough discussion of what happens there. Like having been there as a Black woman, the racism was astounding. And then to come back and for people to say, really, it was racist. And it was just funny because someone who looked like me and wouldn't be considered dark skinned here, but knew there in Cuba that I would not be allowed to have a job at the front desk of the hotel. Like I could only be cleaning the rooms if I was there. Thank you.
No, thank you. And Anna, do we have any books on Cuba coming up? I know we've done some, but we have a whole selection en route.
Yes.
And I think you maybe are going to help with our next
we do not have any. The book by Ariela Gross and Alejandro de la Fuente is one of these books that was published then by the time of COVID-19. It would have been great to bring them, but as you can see from our schedule this year, we have almost one book every 2 weeks. But we keep that in mind. I don't think that I see any books on Cuba for next year. Perhaps there is one that we'll deal with, and the book by Tatiana Seijas, the book that is just here.
Yes.
I really invite you to join us. Now, this is this book we are going to have in March. If you go to slaveryarchive.wordpress.com, and let me just see the date of this one here is March 13. No, March. Oh my God. Okay, March the 3rd. And this is a book with several biographies of Black women all over the Americas. And if I am not mistaken, I think that we certainly have Cuba. It's just that I don't remember who is the author who did Cuba here in this book. Then I invite you to attend this one. Aisha Finch.
Yeah.
She, at least her, is doing Cuba in this book. And I don't remember who else is doing. Then I really invite you to attend then in March the 3rd. And I don't know if we have more questions, Jessica? Nope. Then just for us to invite you then, because I already gave you the link, the address that is slaveryarchive.wordpress.com in order to get the entire program until June. And on February 17, 20, then next week at 5 p.m., you are going to have Michael Hothberg, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators. Michael does memory of the Holocaust, but also African-American memory. And this book is an interesting one to think all the issues of those who participated or who were victimized by these atrocities in more theoretical terms. And he is in literature, but I think that is a book that it can be interesting for us to think the topics that we are looking at in the book club. Then I leave with Jessica to conclude, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you everybody for coming. Huge thank you. Thank you, Erika, for this amazing work. Thank you for joining us and for such generous and rich responses and provocations for us all to think with and think about. Thank you everybody who came and who asked questions and who is just generally part of this community. It's really great to be here on this kind of regular basis. Even though we can't be in person, we will be here next time for the next book project, and we will see you then. So thank you, everybody. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.